Well, you might want to buckle up because this video has it all. From fixing big mistakes to sanding, from power tools to power stretches, from hand tools to hand splinters, to more hand sanding, to bigger mistakes, and to cool joinery, to getting rowdy on the router table and a skew on the table saw, to even more sanding, and of course fixing more mistakes and more sanding. Always under a watchful eye, and ultimately the emergence of a pretty cool coffee table. Here's how it all went down. All right, look, you're nice people. So I'm not going to bore you with the whole milling process that I went through with this white oak, but I stacked and stickered it, let it acclimate to the environmental conditions in my shop, gave it a quick glance, determined it was good to go, and then started laying out the boards for the top of this table. Now, generally, I kind of get lost in the weeds on this stuff. I'll move boards around 10 times, looking at it from this direction, that direction, bird's eye view, worm's eye view, lights bright, lights low, pants on, pants off, because sometimes with white oak, it just looks different in different lighting and from different angles. So once I was happy with the grain and how it looked, I drew a big chalk triangle, hoping that Jerry or Lola would stop by and sit in it, but they were napping. But the real purpose of the chalk triangle, that is to help me put the boards back together the same way. Now, to do this glue up, I am using the Festool Domino. This is not to add strength. It is purely for alignment purposes. This will keep my boards nice and flat across the top so I don't have to fumble with them while I'm worried about slinging glue and clamping clamps. Speaking of that glue and clamps, now it was time to get this thing glued up. And when I'm using dominoes to glue up a tabletop like this, I basically just spread the glue, pop in the dominoes, and stack it up like you were building a retaining wall until you get to that final layer where you drop that on and then carefully lower your drawbridge down and apply some pressure, looking for that perfect glue squeeze out all the way down. I put clamps on the bottom and the top just to make sure I have even clamping pressure. And you may notice I scraped off all the glue squeeze out off the top. Sometimes I wait for it to gel up, but sometimes I do that and I forget and I come back and it's hard as a rock. And that becomes a real pain to get scraped off. So once everything was dry, I'm just drawing a little EKG with my pencil. And then, well, I'm not going to bore you with this. I sand across the grain and then with the grain until my pencil line is gone, giving me a nice flat top. Now I could trim it to length. Now, this was a very specific dimension on the top of this coffee table. It needed to be 52 inches long by 30 inches wide. So I trim one end and trim the other, and now I have a 52-inch long table. My diagonals, just checking these, making sure my tabletop is perfectly square. Whew. All right, that'll work. Now to figure out my base and the dimensions of that. So I go to my sketch pad. You can also see I drew my diagonals on there, showing a dimension of 60 inches from corner to corner. Draw it out. Oh, that's too tall. Yeah, that's better. And those are going to be my joints right there. So my only real guidance on this table was a picture and the dimensions of 16 inches high, and the top needed to be 52 by 30. But all the other dimensions were a complete unknown. So while I love to build a prototype, it really didn't make sense in this case. Well, I shouldn't say that because Jerry and I here are going to build a prototype, but just out of cardboard instead, just to give us some scale and dimensions and check everything before we actually start cutting some wood. So I made this frame here. And then I went to the secret compartment under my pencils to pull out all my drafting curvature tools to start laying things out and realize, you know what? Those were just useless. The best thing is a can of wax and a paint can to give me the curve that I needed. And then with surgeon-like precision, I could cut that with my utility knife. And then it was a little playtime with Lola. I don't know what it is, but she loves chewing on cardboard. Oh, DoorDash is here. But first, let me show you real quick. This is what the base will look like. Well, there'll be two of these, making an X in the middle, but I think those dimensions and proportions look good. And then using the all-new Shaper Studio software right on my iPad, I was able to create the file for the design of the leg and that curvature to make a template. Well, I'll show you later what I used the template for, but how quick and easy was that? So there are multiple ways that you can make this joint. You could do a straight miter across, which would be roughly 55 degrees and a 35-degree miter to get that angle because you have two pieces of differing widths. Or you could do almost an angled haunch. So make a cut and a cut down. Or if you want to get decorative, kind of a curved haunch. I'm going to go with a straight cut here. That way you have this piece meeting the side of this piece. And then I could start ripping down the stock for the base, the top rail, the bottom rail, the outside legs. Now I milled this down to 1 1/4 inches. This is all rift sawn white oak, beautiful stuff. And then with the outside leg pieces cut to rough length, I could do the same thing with the top stretcher and bottom stretcher. And then I'm just gonna do a little bit of a dry fit here, making sure those are square in the corner, making sure that my template actually fits and I have enough material there, and then just tracing it out so we can see how this is gonna look. Using a couple dominoes to figure out where I want my placement, I make my marks, and then I plunge for the dominoes. You could also use dowels here. I don't suggest biscuits. Those will add very little strength. And you have to remember, we have an end grain meeting a long grain, so not the strongest connection. And this is where the dominoes come in. Having that loose tenon will really make this joint rock solid. And then just a dry fit to make sure everything fits together. And then over to the bandsaw to remove the majority of the waste before I start template routing. Unfortunately, my resaw blade doesn't do a really good job around curves. And then over at the table saw, I need to cut the long part of this bottom rail. So I'm gonna do a reverse plunge cut. Yeah, reverse plunge, where I'm going to raise the saw blade up through the material, start and stop at a certain point, so basically a stop cut. And then I will finish up with the jigsaw this time, which will give me a much tighter radius, and it's just a lot easier. Then using a sled at the table saw, I'll cut my outside pieces to their final length. I use a stop block to make sure that all pieces are exactly the same. Because most of the time on a coffee table or dining table, you want all the legs to be the same length. Now it's time to do some pattern routing with the ultimate pattern bit by Bits and Bits, link below. So as you can see here, I made a much bigger template because I wanted it to carry down the base rail as well, base stretcher, if you want to call it that. So using some double-sided tape, I get a splinter, remove it, and then be sure to get plenty of pressure down on that double-sided tape, and I'm going to use some hold-down clamps just for good measure. Now, I accidentally forgot to turn on the camera here for this first pass, but as you can see, not too bad, a little bit of burning. Then I can take the pattern and mirror it over to the other side, stick it down, and start routing. And then I carefully make my way around using some small passes on this side, making sure I get a nice clean cut, not taking too much at once, and then finish up in the little radius in the corner. And I can pop off the template and flip it over and get that little 1/8 of an inch ridge that was left behind because the bit didn't go quite deep enough. So I'll just chuck up a little flush trim bit in my trim router and zip all the way around to get that last little nub. Ah, nice and flush. And here's a vertical view. As you can see, there's some burning on that end grain. It's really hard to avoid, but we can get that out with a little bit of sanding. What do you guys think? Yep. Okay. I appreciate the input. Now it was time to cut my top stretchers to length, and rather than using a tape measure, I'm just using relative dimensioning here and marking a line. I'm also going to add 2 inches onto the end of that line to account for the tenon that will drop down like a bridle joint into those side pieces. So I marked them out and then cut them to length on the table saw. Why the table saw, not the miter saw? Well, I just get a much cleaner cut on the table saw with white oak. Then with a dado stack set up, I could start to work on the tenons. So I'll do one side, flip it over so it's perfectly centered. Now I'm aiming for a 1/2 inch here, which looks pretty good. So then I can set up a stop block. This will establish my shoulder and ensure they are all in the same position. So a few passes on each side, and that creates a nice little tenon. Now I also need to create a little shoulder on the bottom What this will do is as it goes into the mortise, it will hide that joint where the two meet and any inconsistencies there. Then I could mark out for those mortises. I'm using yellow tape here. I found this is much easier for my eye to see pencil on than green tape. Don't worry, still using green tape almost exclusively, but for layout, yellow tape works much better for me visibility-wise. So over at the drill press with a Forstner bit, I remove the majority of the material, and then I can head back to the bench, grab the chisels and a mallet, and get to work. I gotta say, this could be my least favorite task in the shop, aside from hand-cutting dovetails, is using chisels and manually removing the material in a mortise, but it's got to be done. Now, I could have used a router bit with a small trim router, but that would have required quite a bit of setup, and it still wouldn't have gone deep enough based on the bits that I have, so I didn't have much of a choice but to do it by hand. And then with a test fit, I think we're looking pretty good there. Only one more to go. Right, Lola? Mm-hmm. Then I could get to work on figuring out the angle for my half-lap joints for the base. So using a level, I'll just go from corner to corner. And then I cut some sample pieces and use some double stick tape to put them down. That way I could butt my bevel gauge up against this and get a very accurate measurement. So once I tighten that down, I just check my angle plate, and that is showing 30 degrees on the button. Unfortunately, you'll see later that this isn't really the case. Then I could mark out for my dominoes. I'm going to stack two on top of each other here. Now you might be saying, hey, I thought you were using mortise and tenon, not dominoes. Well, that's only on one side. You'll see a little bit later how this thing has to come together in order for assembly to work. So with that, I could start dominoing. Jerry's heading up into his lair to take a nap, and I could continue with my mortises. And more mortises, and more mortises, until we have 8 perfectly spaced domino mortises. Then little Inspector Lola comes in to make sure everything is smelling okay. Here, why don't you park yourself over here? Whoa, pretty much took a bath on the white oak on this one. Not to mention the gas to go pick it up. Newsflash, everyone, inflation is real, and despite prices coming back down since the height of COVID, they're still high, and I'm sure you've noticed they are up and down every day. Now, I'm just a sole proprietor, small business owner. I build furniture, and I film the process to share it with you. And I've never really been good with investments or the stock market or folding a fitted bed sheet or poaching the perfect egg or trying to see the hidden image in one of those 3D posters. Have you ever seen one of those? I haven't. Nevertheless, when it comes to my financial future, my investment strategy is becoming all too real the older that I get. And finding a way to have my money out there working for me instead of against me is extremely important. And that's where the sponsor of today's video, Masterworks, can help. Now, a typical portfolio of stocks and bonds has already lost around 34% this year, according to Bank of America. And my personal 401k has taken an even bigger hit. Isn't that right, Jerry? But research is showing that banks are starting to invest 30 to 50% of our money into alternative assets that can actually be helped by inflation. Assets like what, you might ask? Well, like fine art. Well, I mean, not necessarily this, but instead, how about paintings from legendary artists like Picasso, Banksy, and Monet? Now, data shows the last time inflation was this high, back in the 70s and early 80s when I was running around in my Dukes of Hazzard pajamas, fine art still kept increasing in value by an average of 17.5% per year. In fact, contemporary art prices outperformed the S&P 500 total return by 164% for the past 26 years. Now, Masterworks can help you diversify your portfolio in fine art for a fraction of what billionaires pay to purchase this artwork, by making it possible for people like you and I to invest in shares of this same contemporary art. And the Masterworks team has over 75 years of experience with the art market. In fact, within the last month, Masterworks sold another painting for 17.8% net return. So the last 3 paintings have sold for 17, 21, and 31% net returns. Now, I also want to remind everyone that all of Masterworks' art offerings are filed with the SEC by breaking the shares into parts. They also have nothing to do with crypto or NFTs, and they can't access or move your money around like FTX did. Now, as you can imagine, as inflation keeps raging, demand is growing, and Masterworks actually has a wait list right now. But my subscribers can skip the wait list using the link below at masterworks.art/Keith Johnson. That's masterworks.art/Keith Johnson. Right, Jerry? Now, I know a lot of times on these YouTube videos, whether it be mine or someone else's, sometimes we just make it look easy, like every step of the way is intentional, and we know what we're doing, and we're not afraid to mess up. But I can tell you on this right now, I have to cut a 30-degree half lap on the bottom and on the top rail on both pieces. They have to match perfectly, and they have to line up perfectly with the corners of the table. So my heart's beating a little faster right now as I'm gonna start laying these out and get the table saw set. What I'm doing now is I'm just finding the exact center on both pieces, which these are 60 inches long, so it's 30. 30 is the center, 30-degree angle. Wild. All right, I just want to explain why this is such a mind bender and very tricky and has to be done in a very sequential way. So this piece here closest to me is all dominoed. So that is going to be glued together fully. This piece is going to be glued as just a U, and then this piece, which has the mortise and tenon, well, semi-mortise, is going to drop on top. The reason is I can't slide that piece under, turn it, and then drop it into those half laps. So the other issue is on this bottom rail, one of these notches has to be on the top while the other one is on the bottom, like this. The problem is this bottom rail has this curve on the bottom, so I can't turn it upside down on the table saw to do that. So there are two options. One, do it by hand, pass. Second is to kind of temporarily glue on a block here whose surface is higher than these end little horns, and I would just raise the table saw blade, whatever that height needs to be, to get me my notch on top. Hopefully it can go high enough. And then the ultimate assembly will be the U glued together, this off, turn, drop, and then this drop on. Hopefully this will all become more clear as we start to assemble and glue up and put this whole thing together. All right, here's a perfect example of why I double and triple check everything before I make my cut. So I laid out this piece on here, which looks good. This angle looks right in relation to the corners. But when I place my other piece on top like this, you can see the angles going in the wrong direction. I laid these out identical to one another, whereas they needed to be in opposite directions. So this one here needs to go this way. So luckily I caught this, so I'll fix this one. This one is okay as is, and then we can make the cuts. Well, first, then we'll double check, and then we'll make the cuts.
Then with my miter gauge set at 30 degrees, I could make my first pass with the dado stack, getting close to my layout line on both sides, and then do a test fit. These half laps get a little finicky. This one seems to be going together pretty well. And then that bottom rail with the horns on it, so I'm double stick taping some blocks on there that are just a little bit higher than the tips of those horns. And then I could run it across the table saw, and as you can see, I cannot go high enough with the dado stack to get to the bottom of it. But now I did set up a stop block on my fence to ensure that they were exactly the same position as the other ones, and then I can make my cuts. Now I'll have to go back and clean that up by hand when I'm back at the bench. And just like that, we're back at the bench. So just using a little Japanese saw, keeping it flush up against the wall of that half lap, get me down to my baseline, and then I make a series of kerf cuts. A lot of kerf cuts, in fact. That's a great thing about white oak. You can make the tiniest kerf cuts in between other kerf cuts, and then just using a chisel, I can whittle away until I get to the bottom of my baseline, and I have a nice flat bottom. And then I could do a dry fit. That looks pretty good. Little persuasion there. And then a full assembly.
to make sure everything is looking nice and tidy. So as you can see, I have to come down on the top with that mortise and tenon one to get into the half lap. And there's how it looks. So the next speed bump was this round over needs to be on all of these pieces on one side. So this right here, which is a wide open obtuse angle, no problem for that bearing to ride around and get in there. In here, where we have an acute angle, much tighter, that radius, I'm not really sure how that's going to go. However, I threw together this sample piece and it looks like it's going to work okay. Obviously there's a little gappy there, but even in this tight radius, it looks like it's going to be okay. It'll take a little sanding to get that cleaned up and smooth. But as you can see, I have to do this with this together. Because if I do them separately, then this round over is going to come to here, and this is going to come here, and it's going to look funky. Then I could break it down and head to the router table. Now, I did use a couple of screws to secure those half laps on the top and the bottom so nothing would come apart on the router table. Ultimately, it would have had 2 screws in the top and bottom anyway. So then with this 9/16 round over bit, I could make my first pass. Now, unfortunately, I did make a mistake here, where that round over should not have gone all the way to the end. I should have done that when it was together, but I screwed up. So I'll make it work later, and I'll show you how I did that. Now, I did do this in multiple passes. As you can see, the first pass, and then raise that bit up for the final pass. I just didn't want to hog off that much material in the first pass and end up with any tear out or burning. And that's how it looks, perfectly rounded over. Now, unfortunately for the bottom pieces, just like on the table saw, because of those horns, I couldn't get them to run over the router tabletop. So I used a trim router to take off first pass, and then the big boy router to take off the final 9/16. Now, I'm not going fully down the length of all of these. I'm going to do that with these pieces together once they're mated with the side rails or side legs and the top rails. But I really wanted to get this middle half lap nice and tidy, and this required a lot of handwork, a lot of sanding, and, well, more sanding and even more sanding. At the end of this, my fingers and hands were not too happy with me. So with that half lap finally finessed, I could separate these and then join them to their side legs and top rails together, and then come back with the router in one nice fluid motion all the way around so I have a continuous round over. So with a nice long Pony Jorgensen clamp, I secure everything and then make my way around. And this is where I learned of the error of my ways at the router table, where I should not have carried that round over on those top rails all the way to the end. But first, let's flip this thing over and finish our round over all the way, and then we can get into my screw up. On this top rail, I should not have carried this round over all the way to the ends because it needs to blend in with this side piece. So what I found is I took a couple of scrap pieces and rounded it over all the way, and I found if I moved it up a 1/16 of an inch and then rounded over this again, it brought this round over detail up just enough where when I brought this piece back down, it would blend. Now I still need to do a little touch up in there with some sandpaper, but lesson learned on that one. Don't go all the way to the end. And while I was copping to my mistakes, Jerry was busy doing whatever Jerry does when I'm not looking. Now, before I could glue anything up, I needed to drill some holes on the underside of the top rails for the mounting hardware. This will be bolts and threaded inserts. And then using my fancy new drill press, I could precisely drill to the exact same depth on all holes. This is quite a machine. Way overkill, but I love it. Now, the larger hole accommodates the washer. The smaller interior hole accommodates the bolt. Now, we'll be using 2 different size bolts, one smaller one on the outer pieces that allow for wood movement, and then bigger ones towards the center. And then it was all about sanding again, with sandpaper and sanding sponges and sandpaper and sanding sponges. And then finally, it was glue up time. So anytime I'm using dominoes and at least one side of the joint is done on the tight setting, I glue in those dominoes first. That way I'm not fighting with glue and inserting dominoes on both sides of the joint. Now, because this is a bit of a complex glue up with the half laps as well as the domino joints on the end, I'm using total boat Thixo epoxy, which is going to give me much more open time.
Total boat, baby.
And reduce my stress level as I put this whole thing together, get it lined up and clamped. And I also want to note, this is where labeling all your parts and where they should go is pretty critical, because the tops I did mark, but the bottoms I didn't mark clearly. I had them marked with tape, and when I realized, hey, this doesn't quite fit together right, whew, good thing they didn't fit together right, because otherwise that half lap would have been in the wrong direction, and wow, we would have been in a real pickle. So, got it all sorted out, clamped together, just using some acetone to clean any squeeze out. And then I could move on to the other one. Now remember, this one is going to be just the U that we're going to clamp up. And then during the final glue up, when we drop in that top rail into that mortise and tenon bridle thing, it will all come together as one piece. You guys ever get the feeling in the shop that somebody's watching you? Yeah, me too. And the next day, once everything was dry, I could clean the squeeze out and get back to, well, sanding. Sandpaper and sanding sponges. And then over at the router table, I decided to do the round over on these end legs instead of doing them by hand. It actually worked out pretty well and gave me a nice consistent round over using these feather boards and riding along the fence. Now, since these end legs are now rounded over, when I clamp them all together, when I drop in that half lap top rail, I did not want to risk denting or damaging that round over. So using a cove bit, I cut some sample blocks here and then glued them together to the perfect radius of that outside leg, and they're essentially clamping blocks, which allow my clamps to sit flushly and squarely on both sides. So now we could start the assembly. Back to the Total Boat Thixo epoxy for a little more open time, and I just spread it around the half lap, inside, outside, all around, and then whoop, slide her in, drop it down, and then here comes that half lap on the top. So as you can see now, as we were talking about before, the construction of this is very sequential. Drop in a few screws there to secure it to the top rail, and a clamp to tie it all together. All right, time to peel back the curtain and show you the mistake I made and how I'm going to fix it. So when I drew my center line here from corner to corner in both directions, and then I put a piece down the full width of my material, I didn't really notice that this distance was much different than this here. Meaning that once you put the radius down on, number one, it overhangs on both sides. For some reason in my mind, I thought it would be perfectly flush. So I've tacked on this piece here just to extend the width of the table. So when you drop this in place where it needs to be, the end of that right on the corner of the table, you can see it overhangs a little bit here, but a lot more here. So if I had adjusted this angle, I just did this on the computer, 2/10 of a degree, so that this moved that way a little bit, it would have been centered. This piece still would have been too long and overhanging, and I would have had to make it smaller so that the radius would line up with the edges of the table. So like I should have done ahead of time, rather than just looking at a picture, I should have drawn this out on the computer, is if I make the top a little bit wider, 3/4 of an inch wider, then when this comes around like this, then everything lines up. The radius hits on the outside corner there, and the radius will hit on the outside corner here. So it really, wow, it really only needs to be 1/4 inch. All right, so right now the back corner is set where it needs to be, where the radius is on the edge and the back edge. This is perfectly on the edge. So when I draw this radius here, right here is the edge of where the table needs to be, which is merely 3/4 of an inch wider. So I can't just tack on a piece of 3/4 of an inch material. That could be noticeable. So I'm gonna cut the table down the middle, cut a little bit of excess out the middle because each of these boards were slightly different in size, and then I'm going to slip in another piece, making the whole piece 3/4 of an inch wider. I will still have to resize these ends a little bit, possibly. So with my tail between my legs in utter disappointment, I had to cut my perfectly beautiful top right down the middle. And after looking at it for a while, I realized just cutting down the middle wasn't going to work, so I had to cut a little bit off the end, and that way the pieces were roughly the same size, and it took quite a bit of figuring to get the grain right now with this other piece, and I ended up making several cuts and then gluing it all back together again. And while all this was going on, Jerry was doing what he does best: nothing.
All right, while that was in the clamps, then I could get to sanding everything. Yes, more sanding with the sanding sponge. It actually works pretty great. This is by Unita. I think you can get them at sandpaper.com. And then on these top rails, I just tack on a sacrificial piece to make sure I don't round them over, and then check with a straight edge. And now with my new top glued and sanded, I could actually cut the base. This was heartbreaking, folks, but thank goodness for the track saw. So I cut them, trimmed them, rounded them over, and then rounded them over to the final 9/16. And then back to sanding yet again. Did I mention that I did a lot of sanding on this one? Now we could check and see how this thing fits. That fits close to the corner. Trace that radius and actually cut this template using the shaper origin. Cut off the waist just so I don't have to round that over. And then using that flush trim bit or pattern bit, I patterned it. Now you'll notice the burning. That's merely a product of how slow I was going, so it was creating a lot of friction and heat and burning. I just didn't want to veer off course, which is why I was going so slow. But it easily cleaned up with some sanding. Now there was a lot of back and forth on how this tabletop should interact with the base. It almost wanted to be flush, but I was afraid that with expansion and contraction, it wouldn't end up flush at some point. So there was also talk of a rabbet, create a shadow line, but ultimately we decided on a 3/16 overhang. So with two corners rounded over and the base now on top, I could mark out the new round over and how much I needed to trim off the table, which ended up being about 1/8 of an inch. And then I could round over the other corners, get plenty of burning, and sand them clean. And then to mark the position for my threaded inserts in the bottom of the tabletop, I'm just using the brad point bit that I used to drill those holes and mark them all out, and then I could drill. Now you'll notice two different size threaded inserts. For the 4 closest to the middle, I'm using 5/16 by 18-inch bolts. For the outer ones, I'm using 1/4 20s. But the holes that I drilled into the underside of the coffee table base are the same. So what that does is the 5/16 18 fits snug and the 1/4 20s fit loose, which will allow for wood movement. Meanwhile, Lola was trying to find my pencil for me. Now my general process for sanding for applying OSMO is I sand up to 220 and then come back with 180 by hand in the direction of the grain. I'm using raking light here, which allows me to see any swirl marks or any other imperfections I may have missed. And then it was OSMO time. I'm using OSMO Pollux 3043 clear satin. If you've never seen this before, it is a hard wax oil, much like Rubio Monocoat, except for these natural color woods, I find that this doesn't yellow as much as the Rubio Pure does. So I spread it around just using a little squeegee and then a white Scotch-Brite pad to work it all into the surface. Let it set up for 5 or 10 minutes and then rub off or wipe off all the excess with a microfiber cloth. So once the top was done, I could move over to the base using the same process. In this case, I just take that Scotch-Brite pad and dip it right into the can and saturate it and then coat everywhere, and then I could finally wipe it down with the microfiber cloth until it's dry to the touch. Now I let this cure for about 48 hours, came back with some 600 grit, lightly sanded, wiped it down, and put another coat on. I actually put 3 coats on the top for a little more durability. Then it was time for a morning stretch, and we could attach the base and get ready for delivery. And then in each hole, I could drop in a black washer and then start with the bolts. Now, as I mentioned, the ones towards the center, those 4 at the middle are 5/16 18. Those are going to be my stable point that allow that expansion and contraction to happen outwards in each direction from there. And then I could drop in the 1/4 20 bolts and secure those. And then this one was ready for delivery. I think it actually fits the space really nicely, complements the carpet and the couch. And who knows, there may be another white oak piece in the future for this space. Stay tuned.